The Sony Alpha 7 cameras, or the A7 cameras, have been very popular, especially the ones that are more affordable, the ones that don't have the extra letter in the name. For example, the A7R V is geared more towards the higher resolution, more centered around still photos, and then you got the A7S series, for example, the A7S3, that's centered around video for more sensitivity instead of resolution. So those two are more specialized. And then you have the ones that don't have the extra letter, for example, the A7 III that I'm currently shooting on, or the A7 IV that's currently out, that replaces the A7 III. There are rumors that is saying that Sony is going to be announcing the Sony A7 V coming up in 2025, and that would be the replacement for the A7 IV. I don't have any official specs or any news, so I'd say let's put on our thinking caps and come up with a list of 10 features that, at least according to me, should be a part of the Sony A7 V. I don't know if I should wear it backwards or not. Number 1, being able to use the Sony NP-FZ100 batteries. The Sony A7 III and the Sony A7 IV currently both uses the Sony NP-FZ100 batteries, and if you're able to reuse batteries from an existing camera, that is always a good thing to cut down on costs and also to cut down on e-waste. Number 2, having a more durable shutter installed on the Sony A7 V. If you're going through different forums around the Sony A7 III as well as the Sony A7 IV cameras, one of the things that you might come across is people complaining about the shutters prematurely failing on those cameras. They'll be in mid-shoot, all of a sudden the camera errors out because the shutter broke apart and now they're out of camera. Now, this doesn't happen to all the cameras. I have the Sony A7 III with me, and then knock on wood, right now it's currently working fine. It's been about 5 years, give or take. Now, I do use my cameras on the weekend for my YouTube videos and my photos, but some people would be using their cameras a lot more. But I'm not sure exactly, again, how they're using the camera that would cause that, or if it's just a random failure. But I did find that there's an increased chance of that happening more on the Sony mirrorless cameras compared to when I was back with Nikon during my DSLR days. So with the D7100, the D300, and even the D50, the one I have back over there, I didn't really see a whole lot of people complaining about shutter issues, but hopefully with the stronger shutters that are hopefully installed on the Sony A7 V, that would put people's minds at ease when buying the camera. Number 3, the sensor. And when I say the sensor, I don't mean the image resolution or the number of megapixels that are available for the sensor. Frankly, on the Sony A7 III, which has 24 megapixels, I'm perfectly fine with that. I know on the Sony A7 IV, they do have that bumped up to 36 megapixels. And for the Sony A7 V, if Sony decides to bump that back down to 24 megapixels, I wouldn't be mad about that. What I think Sony should do is invest into their IBIS system, the in-body image stabilization system that will help stabilize a photo or a video if the camera body is shaking. And I think a lot of people can benefit from that, especially people that are vlogging, right? You're trying to remove those micro jitters and possibly beyond that. And also people that are shooting in dark environments where the shutters are much slower. I think that can impact a lot of people much more than something like resolution. Number 4, being able to customize your file name. And this is specifically for your video files. And I know that sounds a little bit weird, but let me explain. On the Sony A7 III, not sure about the A7 IV if they fixed this or not, but at least on the Sony A7 III, I do struggle a little bit about how they name their videos compared to how they name their images, because they're done differently. The way the naming convention works on images is that there's a 4-digit number that represents your image, and that increments by 1 every time you take a photo. Fine. If you reformat your card, that number will be retained and it will continue where it last left off in the numbering system. However, on the video side of things are a little bit different. Sony will start with C0001.mp4, and then it will increase the number for your next video clip, and then so on and so forth. If you reformat your memory card, it will reset that counter, and then start from C0001.mp4 again. And the problem with this is that if you do this multiple times in a single project and you try and bring everything together, well, now you have a naming conflict. And you can solve that by having multiple folders. So not a showstopper, but I think being able to choose if you want that behavior versus having the behavior where it will retain that last number and then just keep going on from there. I think being able to choose between the two would be helpful. Another thing, at least with the Sony A7 III, is that if you're recording different clips, let's say you have C0001, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you have the bad habit of deleting files as you're recording on the camera, and let's say you delete file number 3, and then you record the next file, you have 1, 2, 4, and 5, you expect the next number to be 6. But no, because you deleted 3, Sony will create the next file, but name it as C0003, not C0006. And that's really confusing to me because now the file naming does not match chronologically of the events that happened. So I know not the best practice to delete stuff off of the camera, but please, Sony, stop that. Number 5, let's talk about the dials. On some of the more modern Sony cameras, Sony started to implement locks on dials so that you don't accidentally bump them and change the setting. On the Sony A7 III, I don't have any locking dials, and honestly, I'm fine with that. So if Sony must put locking dials, and I think that kind of gets in a way, at least in my opinion, I would like the ability to leave them unlocked. So the ones that have the push to lock and keep locked, and then if you push it to unlock and it stays unlocked, I guess that's fine. It's a good compromise. So that way people that want that feature can have that feature, and then those that want to keep the dials unlocked can also do so. Number 6, having more options to shoot with slow motion. Now, I know this is one of those things that's much easier said than done, but with Sony, I feel like a lot of the cameras top out at 120 frames per second, even in 1080p, and I feel like with today's technologies, you should be able to go beyond that. Now, I'm not just saying that just to say that. With Nikon, their Z6 Mark III does do 1080p with 240 frames per second right out of the box, and that's pretty nice. And it costs about the same as the Sony A7 IV at $2,500. So for around the same price, it's being able to do more. And I know it's a newer camera, but even with action cameras, some of them will allow you to shoot at 240 frames per second right out of the box at a much lower price range. And for Sony, I know the A7S III does do 240 frames a second, but I think for the A7 V, with today's technology, I think we can try to see if we can push the envelope there, right? Try to do 240 frames a second, if not 480 frames a second for the A7 V, and then for the S series, so that we're not cannibalizing other lines of cameras. Maybe put a cap on the amount of time for the A7 V to record at those higher speeds. Number 7, the screen. Ooh, I am jealous of the Sony A7 IV users because the screens actually rotate out so you can see yourself while you're recording instead of needing an external monitor. So on the A7 III, if you don't know, the screen only flips up and flips down. It doesn't flip out, so you can't see yourself while you're recording and just kind of crossing your fingers that you're hoping you're within the frame. But anyway, so you have that traditional flip out screen that will allow you to see yourself if you're recording yourself. But on the A7R5, Sony did something pretty cool, and that is having a screen that tilts up and down like your traditional old school flip screen, but also it combines that ability to swivel the screen outwards so you can see yourself as well. And the advantage of having both I guess multiple points of articulations for this screen is that for users that want the screen centered with the eyepiece, you can just flip the screen up on the A7R5, or if you want to see yourself, the whole thing can also pop or rotate out so you can see yourself from the other side of the lens. So that's pretty cool. Number 8, having a dedicated EVF button. I think this is important because Sony, as well as other camera manufacturers, will allow you to switch between what information is displayed where, including only turning on your EVF, your electronic viewfinder, and not your rear LCD screen, or the opposite, turning on your rear LCD screen and disabling the EVF. And the advantages of having the different modes is that, for example, if you're in a dark environment and you don't want to disturb others around you with a bright rear LCD screen, you can say to the camera, hey, only use the electronic viewfinder, only turn on the EVF, and disable the rear LCD screen. The problem with that is if you accidentally forget to set it back and you're going to a different environment and all of a sudden you need to use the rear LCD screen to compose your shots. Now you're putting your camera up to your face, trying to stumble through the menus to re-enable the rear LCD screen, and it's a bit of a hassle. But if you have a dedicated button that will switch between those modes, I think it will be more useful to have that than, let's say, a custom button where you're tying that up versus having it do something else that's useful. This, I feel like, should be maybe off to the side, but having a dedicated button will allow you to know exactly where it is, and if you need to toggle that function, you can do so pretty quickly. Number 9, being able to update individual settings within a custom shooting mode. With the Sony cameras, you have different memory slots that you can preset settings to, such as the custom slot 1, 2, and in some cameras, 3. On the Sony A7 III, there's only 2 slots that you can preset your settings into. And the way this works is that you select a mode outside of those custom dials. So for example, manual mode or aperture priority mode. You configure all your settings, your resolution, if you want like an intervalometer to be on, silent shooting mode, stuff like that. You set all that and then you commit it to your memory slot 1 or 2, right? And then that gets saved. But if you ever want to make a tweak to that, even if it's just one setting, you would have to exit that mode, go back to that aperture priority, shutter priority, or manual, what have you, reset those settings, and then resave over all your settings in that slot 1 or slot 2 or slot 3. And I think this should be an easier way of doing that, where within that custom shooting mode and say, hey, this is one thing I want to change, apply, and then keep everything else the same. On the A7 IV, I did read that there is a special mode, like a flexible shooting mode of some kind that you can use, but I've never used it on the A7 IV, nor do I own the A7 IV, so I can't really speak to that. And then finally, number 10, last but not least, having a top LCD screen. Now, I know this goes against all of the Sony A7 bodies in terms of the design, but I guess I can be hopeful, right? I really do miss having the top LCD screen that you find in those traditional DSLRs, but even some of the Nikon and Canon mirrorless cameras do have like an updated version of that top LCD screen. I think it's like an OLED screen or something that's on some of those cameras out there. And I think it's pretty cool to have it because if you have your camera that's hanging from your neck without needing to tilt the body up to look at the rear LCD screen, you get an overview of your basic settings, right? Your aperture, your shutter speed, maybe even your ISO. I'm not sure, depending on the size of the screen, what you can fit in there. You can get a pretty quick overview of your current settings without even tilting your camera or activating the rear LCD screen, which is often filled with other information, and it just makes the usability a little bit easier. Sony can take the dial from the right side, move it to the left side, make some room for a small screen. But you know, for me, I think that makes sense. But for others, they like the more minimalistic design of not having that top LCD screen, and probably save a little bit of power at the same time. But for me, I kind of disagree with that, and I really wish Sony would put the little LCD screen there at the top. That concludes the top 10 wish list that I have for the rumored upcoming Sony A7 V. Do you have wishes of your own if you had the power to design the Sony A7 V, such as anything from a faster sensor readout to maybe even panoramic stitching features that's built in within the camera body, or maybe something as wild as having backlit buttons so that you don't have to hunt around for the buttons if you can't fill them out at night? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, and I'll see you in the next video.